Ken, please
Yeah.
introduce yourself. Let us to know more about you.
I'm a writer. My most recent book is Healthy to 100, which you can see in the background there. But for the last, I spent most of my career in media. But for the last 6 or 7 years, I've led what's called the Longevity Project, which tries to foster greater public understanding around the opportunity and challenges of longer life. And we look at everything from the drivers of longevity, beginning at birth, to how to rethink the life course so that more people can have longer, healthier lives. And I've been interested in the topic of social connection for some time, social connection and purpose for some time. And my book flows from the travels I did across 5 countries last year, some of the 5 healthiest aging countries in the world, to try to understand the role of social connection and how those countries are building social health infrastructure to allow people in the second half of life to do exactly what you just asked about, which is to have purpose in the second half of life. So it's a very important question because, I mean, I only speak for the United States because that's the country I know the best. But we've really, over the last 100 years, built up the notion that retirement is the end. It is, sometimes we call it the decline narrative. It is the time that we begin to wind down and finish up our life. So, I mean, we sort of developed the 3 stages of life. The first third is learning, the second third is work, and the third is dying, is basically what it amounts to. And what I've discovered is, the healthiest societies understand sort of the new consequences of greater longevity in places like Japan, where the median life expectancy for women is now 90. Turning 65, you have on average, 25 years of life in front of you, life that is healthier if you have purpose and meaning and social connection. And countries like Japan are creating opportunities for people, not just Japan, but the healthiest countries are really thinking of the second half of life after 50, as being as important and meaningful and purposeful as the first. There's no reason it shouldn't be. And they're creating opportunities, whether it's in work or lifelong learning or volunteer or intergenerational relationships, to help people find that purpose and meaning in the second half of life just as they had in the first.
Great. But do you believe that the youngers are prepared to do different? Because you need, okay, we are not older, but older than our children, for example. So we need to prepare our children and their generation to achieve better levels when they will be older. So we need to prepare the scenarios for us, but I believe it's more important to prepare a scenario for aging for the new generation. Do you believe it's possible?
Yeah, so I do think people ask me questions a lot about like how these other countries have rethought the life course, and they often ask about policy, and government policy. But I think here is one of those things where the expression in English is politics is downstream of culture. Making culture change will lead to good policy change. And I think that culture change in this context means changing the cultural consensus that sort of life ends at 65 to a broader cultural understanding that longer, healthier life can extend much longer, especially if everyone understands that the second half of life could be as meaningful as the first. It's not easy at a place like US, where we have such a cult of youth and we have such intergenerational conflict. But ultimately, I mean, I think to your point, the youth are stakeholders in the future as much as we are. And I think, they're looking at a world in which many of them have good chances of living to 100. I mean, the number of centenarians will increase tenfold by mid-century, and probably another tenfold by the end of the century. The people who are in their teens, and my son is 18, some of my colleagues who work in their 20s, they're looking at a much different life course than we have, and certainly than my parents had. And I think change begins with involving them in the conversation of what that future looks like, right? If it's seen as a zero-sum game between the older generations and the younger generations, we're never going to have that cultural consensus that leads to a better future for people over 50. It can be done, I've talked about Japan, but in Korea, where they've placed a big emphasis on lifelong learning. It's a constitutional right. There's an idea that learning doesn't stop when you're 18 or 21 or 25. It's something that you should do throughout your life. And everyone understands that, the young and the old alike. And that's the type of cultural consensus that leads to, I think, inspires change for both the young and the old.
I have a concern specific about social media. People need human relations.
Yeah.
And how can, not to fix, but how can you prepare or change this mind? Because I have a concern about my daughter, my son, my son-in-law, and other many people in their young, because one day they will be older.
So it's a great question and a tough question, right? So I think, the loneliness crisis in the United States, and I think a lot of places, is a reflection of technology. I mean, the book Bowling Alone that Robert Putnam wrote about the decline of social capital has to do with the decline of organizations that brought people together, whether it was churches or unions or sewing circles or parent-teacher associations. Those brought people together physically in community. And those organizations declined because, well, when he wrote the book, it was because of television, and now it's because of phones. And, my son, who's 18, and his generation spends an hour less a day with friends than I did, my generation did. They're much more likely to have, people today are much more likely to report having no friends, and much less likely to report having 6 or more friends than even 20 years ago. There is a real loneliness crisis, and that's because, I like to say that my son would spend 25 hours a day on his phone if he could figure out how to slow the rotation of the earth. I think, though, and I don't think there's an easy answer to that, right? You're not going to stop technology. You're not going to stop kids from using phones. You're not going to stop adults from using phones. The thing that has inspired me in other places is not that they don't use technology. I mean, if you get on the subway in Singapore or in Seoul, everyone is face down in their phones, just like they are in my hometown of Washington, D.C. Technology is same, but social connection is better there because they have invested in what I like to call social connection infrastructure, social health infrastructure, that even in the world of phones brings people together. It could be work, it could be life. When people talk about lifelong learning in Korea, they don't talk about how to get online and take a course. They talk about how to have classrooms that are within 5 minutes of every neighborhood in the city. When they talk in Singapore about senior centers and healthy and active aging centers, they talk about how to bring people out of their apartments, create incentives to bring people out of their apartments and into community. And that's even the design of the city, the design of apartments. Apartments are really small. Public areas are very generous. It is designed to want people to get out of their apartments and be next to each other. Or in Barcelona, where they've redesigned the city so that people get out of cars. It's hard to be socially connected when you're driving past each other. So there are things that happen that, I don't think we're going to, as much as I like, take all the phones and beat them with sledgehammers. as much as I think that would actually be healthy for a lot of people. But I know there are ways that incentivize and bring people out of their homes and bring them next to each other. The key to having friends, the research is that it's about proximity. It's not about anything other than putting people next to each other for long periods of time. 50 hours to be a friend, 200 hours to be a close friend. And that's should be the goal, is not to say phones are terrible. They are, but they're going to exist. Let's create ways that bring people out of their houses and put them next to each other.
And about your research, and among the countries you studied, Japan, Korea, Spain, Italy, and Singapore, which social and cultural practice impressed you the most in terms of keeping older adults active and socially connected? Do you believe that is there something that Brazil or Latin America countries could learn from these examples?
So I think we can all, all of us, Brazil and Latin America and the United States, can learn from. I actually do think, so let me actually start with intergenerational connections and intergenerational relationships. I think Latin America actually, in the research, has an advantage over the United States in terms of how they think about intergenerational connections. So in the United States, which some people have described with sort of age apartheid, like we keep the generations apart. That's sort of considered a natural order of things to divide the generations. Those other countries believe differently, and they create projects and programs and incentives to bring the generations together. And in Singapore, which is crazy about it, they use housing policy to keep families together for as long as possible. They designed all the buildings for intergeneration. They've stopped creating senior buildings. They only create intergenerational buildings. They invest in educational programs that bring the generations together. It is a formal social policy in those places that we should all recognize that all generations are better if they spend time together. I think that's, I will say I spent a lot of time sort of saying like how these other countries are doing it better than the United States. I think in some ways, some of the most impressive things I've seen though is the United States. I was up in Maine at a place called Gorham House, which is a nursing home and preschool co-located together just last month. And it's really a beautiful thing to see the joy that the kids bring the older folks, but it's also amazing to see the developmental impact that spending time with older folks has on younger people, even little kids. We were told by the elementary school teachers in Gorham that the most empathetic kids in their class are the kids who come through the Gorham preschool. They're the ones who, when a new kid shows up in a wheelchair, aren't scared of it because they've seen lots of people in wheelchair. They're attuned to differences and physical differences in ways that most kids aren't. So, a lot of really beautiful things come out of bringing the generations together.
Great. And Ken, let's talk about community policies and the challenges. How do you see the role of companies, universities, and community organizations in creating environments that foster social connection and purpose in later life?
Yeah. So it's a great question, and it's actually a bunch of different questions. So let's start with companies. I spent, as I mentioned, time in Japan, and sometimes social change is driven by economic need. So in Japan, where 30% of the public is over the age of 65, and the number of people in the age of the traditional labor force, 1864, is in decline. Companies that sort of, which used to be very rigid about retirement policies, have all of a sudden come to believe that older workers have real value, and believe that working is not only good for companies, it's good for older people as well. And that's a widespread belief in Japan that work creates purpose, creates meaning, creates social connection, and that all relates to good health. And what the companies have done in places like Japan is they've started to create really sort of a new set of work rules for people in over 65. So Japan is very famous for its competitive work environment, but the jobs that people in the age 65 take are rather different. Companies have created a lot more part-time job. They've created a lot more job sharing. They've invested heavily in assistive technology. They've really tried to create, because they need to, an environment in which older workers can flourish on their own terms. So that's what companies can do, I think, as an example. I think let me just sort of pause there and see what kind of follow-up you have on that.
In closing, if you could say just one message, or give us just one message for those watching us, especially for people who are reinventing their lives after 50, what would be to the core lesson you've learned from healthy to 100?
Yeah, well, so there's so many. I'm not entirely sure. I'll give you a few. One is social connection is as important to your health as, or maybe more important to your health than lots of other things, including genetics. And we should take it as seriously, with as much intent and purpose and focus as we do on nutrition or healthcare or exercise. That is one. And that the two is, I think the most important thing is treat the second half of life as it's important, as meaningful and purposeful as the first. There's no reason that we have to think about winding down at 60 or 65. Those are important, valuable, productive, meaningful years ahead of you, if you treat it with that same type of seriousness of purpose and planning as you did the first 50. And it's not only just for your own health, it's for the health of your community and your society. We cannot afford to have people after 50 or 60 sort of turn it off in a super age societies like we all live on. Our success as communities will depend upon the contributions of people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s as we do younger people. So that's and there are places that are really building their futures around that idea.
Very good.
Thank you.
All right. So I will
thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.